I would like to really express my appreciation to you and Julie and the other staff at the Wichita Public Library who have put together this series of talks. It's really been an amazing experience to have the virtual big read, and I think it's a real gift to the Wichita community. And I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to talk about Greece. It's one of my favorite subjects. And I hope that everyone who's joining me today for this short visit to ancient Greece will get just a hint of Greece's magic and why those of us who have been there love it so much. There is, in my opinion, no place like Greece on earth. If you go from the mountaintops to the islands and Homer's wine-dark seas, it's a place brimming with stories. Myth and mystery are never very far from the surface. My own personal experience, I traveled through southern part of mainland Greece for the first time in 1992. I returned again in 1997 to see parts of northern Greece, and then I went back for a third time in 2016 with my husband, Kurt Sherry, who's also a speaker in this series. Each time I would pack my blue guide, here's the blue guide that I took with me, and rent a car in Athens. Now, traveling by car allowed me to visit the more remote parts of Greece and to spend as much time at each site as possible. So let's start with Athens here. All right, here we are. This is the Acropolis in Athens, where you rent your car. Driving in Athens or in Greece, doesn't matter whether you're in the mountains or in the city, it's not for the faint of heart. I will say that right up front. Many of the roads, especially before Greece sort of cleaned up before the 2004 Olympics, are very narrow and winding. Some are only wide enough for a donkey, which means if you see another vehicle coming from the opposite direction, you have to back up and let them go by. Now, usually there's a cliff on one side of the road and a ravine on the other and no guardrail. So this is driving in Greece. And that said, I found Greece a splendid place to travel alone, and I felt absolutely safe at all times. So my first two trips, I was driving by myself. And even though I was driving, I found I couldn't stop at every ancient site in my blue guide. I had to be selective. And so it's the same way with the slideshow. I've chosen a few of the places that I visited that have a connection, at least in my mind, to Madeline Miller's Circe. Okay, so connections to Circe in terms of traveling ancient Greece. The first organizing theme that I used was some of the Olympian gods and goddesses who appear in the book have sites that I visited, especially I'm going to focus on Athena and Poseidon, but also Zeus and Apollo. So these are four of the Olympians. There are also some actual historical settings that appear in Miller's book. And of those, I'm really going to focus on Kanathos in Crete and Mycenae. But my real focus, probably the bulk of the talk, is going to be a focus on the sacred sites that were shared by the Titans and the Olympian deities. There's a real focus in Circe with the battle between the Olympians subduing the Titans and the overcoming the old gods, sort of putting them in a subsidiary position. And as you visit the sanctuaries in ancient Greece, you'll see that there's evidence there of the worship of both. And sometimes they kind of come together in interesting ways. So I chose four sanctuaries that kind of pick up on that theme. Now, the most difficult theme, the most difficult problem when you're talking about Circe is that she is a nymph. And nymphs really don't get a lot of architecture or sanctuaries dedicated to them. They're minor river goddesses. They're associated with springs and rivers. And of course, Circe lives on Aea, which is not, you can't find that on any map. But I wanted to talk a little bit about nymphs and where they might have been venerated. And so I'm going to end my talk with a sacred spring that has some ties to both ancient and modern Greece. And so we're going to see how that association continues today. Now, when you talk about Greek civilization, what do we mean by ancient Greece? There's a lot of Greek past that we're talking about. And there's a little bit of a disconnect in the slideshow because Circe's immortal, right? But her story really belongs to the two earliest eras in Greek history, the Minoan age and the Mycenaean age. And that is the period about which the Mycenaean age, about which Homer writes in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So Homer actually lives around 700 BC, but he's looking back to the Mycenaean age and retelling the stories that have been carried on by the bards and poets of Greece for many, many years. My slides, by contrast, are from that period when Homer lived, the Archaic period, which runs from about 750 to 480 BC, and the Classical period, which ends in 323 BC. So we're talking about Circe, but the pictures are really from later. They wouldn't occur at the same time as the story, and we'll develop that more as we go along. And of course, Greek history doesn't stop with the collapse of classical Athens. It continues on, and these later periods also appear as you visit sites in ancient Greece. We think of tourism as a modern phenomenon, but actually it starts in late antiquity when the Romans are traveling to Greece because they want to see the famous sites and temples that they have read about in the mythology. So when you're traveling through ancient Greece, you're also traveling through late antique Greece, Byzantine Greece, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, I want to add that the Greek nation itself didn't exist until 1822, when it became independent from the Ottoman Empire. So when I say Greece, it's not really a country that we're referring to so much as it is the Hellenic cultures and peoples that lived in the peninsula of Greece over a very long period of time. Okay, so here is Athena and here's Poseidon. We're gonna start with them because their actions really frame the narrative of Circe in many ways. Athena, of course, considers Odysseus to be her favorite. She is his defender and patron. She is to Circe a very threatening figure on numerous occasions because of her power. Poseidon, on the other hand, is the one who puts Odysseus into so much difficulty. He's the one that sends the contrary winds that keep him from reaching Ithaca. So the two of them they're on opposite sides of Odysseus's story. And they were also on opposite sides of the story of the founding of Athens. The two of them competed, as the story goes, to become the patron deity of the city. Poseidon offered the horse. This was his gift to Athens, but Athena beat him with the olive tree. So on the Parthenon, near the Parthenon, which is the main temple, on the Acropolis dedicated to Athena, there was always an olive tree growing. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about the Parthenon because we're going to go, as I said, beyond Athens, but I wanted to say a little bit about it that's helps frame some of the later places that we're going to visit. Most of us think of it as the classical temple that was built in 447 BC as a temple to Athena Parthenos, which means Athena the Virgin. And there are actually temples to other aspects of Athena that exist on the Acropolis. There's a temple to Athena Promachos, there's Athena Palos, there's other aspects of this deity. But the Parthenon is the largest shrine to Athena, and it contained the statue. This ivory and gold statue was in the Parthenon, and it was 39 feet tall and covered. It was made from ivory and decorated with gold plating. Now, the gold plating could be removed. So if Athens ran out of money, they could go and ask Athena for a loan. Now, this statue didn't survive. All we have is this miniature Roman copy that I'm showing here on this slide. One of the suggestions is that the Emperor Constantine took the original statue and installed it when he was building Constantinople. We think of the Elgin marbles and all the art that was removed from Greece, but this actually started a long time earlier. So for 750 years, the Parthenon was a temple, a pagan temple to Athena. What happened when the Byzantine Empire became the ruling force in the Greek area, and the Parthenon was simply converted to a Christian cathedral, and it's dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Panagia Atheniotissa, which just means the Virgin of Athens. So you can see a real interesting continuity there. It continues to be a temple of the Virgin. And for 1,000 years, it was used as a Christian cathedral. First under the Eastern Rite, and then after the Second Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, excuse me, from about 1205 on, it was a Latin Rite temple under the Roman Catholic Church. Then in 1460, after Byzantium falls to the Ottomans, it becomes a mosque. So you have this real continuity of worship. And it was interesting when we were in Athens the last time that we took a picture, my husband took a picture of this cross above one of the pillars on the Parthenon. So you can see where crosses were added when it was a Christian church, and also a kind of a block that survived from the base of the ambo or the pulpit in the church. Poseidon didn't make it as the patron of Athens, but he still has a shrine nearby. This is a very famous temple of his at Sunion, which is a cape about 40 miles south of Athens. There are two connections between Sunion and Circe's story, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to say just something about the temple. It is one of the most intact. It has about 15 columns still standing out of the original 42. And it is probably the most magnificent location. All the shrines to Poseidon are near the sea. Now, of course, sailors and fishermen relied on Poseidon to send them favorable seas and favorable winds. And so this is one of the reasons why his temples are near the sea. In the Odyssey, Menelaus, who is the brother of Agamemnon, stops at Sunion on his way back from Troy. So he's still on good terms, apparently, with Poseidon when Odysseus is not. It's also, if we remember the story of the Minotaur, which is referred to in Circe, it's also where the king of Athens waited for his son Theseus to return from Crete. And so Theseus was supposed to send up a white flag if he survived the Minotaur, but he forgot. He had the black flag flying, and his father despaired and committed suicide at Sunion. So there's a connection to Crete, where we're going to visit next. There was also a monumental statue of Poseidon at Sunion, but you can no longer see it. It's also disappeared. This is a statue that was fortuitously discovered on an island in the Aegean in the 1870s. And so that gives you some idea of what he looked like. So ancient cities and places, the earliest place in Greece and the oldest archaeological site is Kanathos on the island of Crete. Crete was where Minos lived with Pasiphae, and in this book, Circe, Pasiphae is Circe's sister. It's 100 miles south of Athens, but that's a little misleading. It's a 7-hour ferry ride to get there. So this is the one place I haven't actually been to, but I have a few pictures of it. The Minoans were the oldest civilization in Europe, and no one really believed. It was sort of a mythical place until 1900, when this British archaeologist, Arthur Evans, came there. He was encouraged after Schliemann discovered Troy, confirmed that Troy was a real place. He came and excavated Kanathos. And there's a lot of criticism about Evans' reconstructions today. He was a little free with his arrangement of things. But it's one of the most visited places in ancient Greece. They get about 6,000 people a year. And they've restored the beautiful Minoan art in a lot of the rooms you see in the throne room of King Minos. And also these horns of consecration refer to the bull cult, which the story of the Minotaur is part of. Bulls were worshipped in Greece, and they were part of sacrificial rituals. And those horns, this is the name that Evans gave them, the horns of consecration. We really just don't know that much about Minoan culture. So it was his idea that they sat on the roofs of the palace. And so that's where he put them. Now in Circe, Madeline Miller has a little bit of a dilemma. She has Circe and Dedalus talk about what are they going to do with the Minotaur once he grows up and he can't be contained in the cage that Dedalus built. And so they kind of say, well, what about putting him in that warren of storerooms that lies underneath the palace? Now, actually, we don't really know where the labyrinth was or if it actually existed, but these storerooms do exist. You can visit them in Kanathos, and I'm sure that Miller did so. There were large vats. You can see these reproduction vats that held olive oil and grain. And then this is the whole, what she referred to as the warren or the network of underground storerooms. And so she kind of suggests that maybe these storerooms, which were underneath the palace, formed the basis for the labyrinth. But actually, most archaeologists think that the labyrinth was not at Knossos. Okay, the other ancient city that I want to talk about is Mycenae. And of course, this is the start of the Iliad. It begins here. Mycenae was a subject city to the Minoans for a long time, and there are Minoan artifacts that were found at Mycenae. So we know there was definitely trade and a lot of contact between the two. But around 1400 BC, the Mycenaeans dominate the Mediterranean. They replace the Minoans as the lead power in that area. Now you can see this gate. This is the entrance to Mycenae, and it's called the Lion Gate. Circe refers to it at the very end of the book. She says maybe now that she's not on Aea anymore, she'll travel and she'll visit the Lion's Gate. It's the entrance to Agamemnon's citadel. And it's from here where Agamemnon leads his army to Troy, and they sail from the Bay of Argos. Here's another view of the Lion Gate. You can see that this is a much more fortified city than the Minoan palace. Didn't even have any walls around it. Obviously, they weren't worried about being attacked, but Mycenae we're really in the age of the great warriors, and this is a kind of a enclosed citadel to defend against enemies. Now, we don't really know if, when Agamemnon lived, okay, or even if he is buried here, but because of his significance in the Iliad, there's the palace at Mycenae has been ascribed to him, and so they'll talk about the palace of Agamemnon. And you can even, if you're walking through, it'll even tell you exactly where he died, where Clytemnestra killed him after he came back from Troy. And notice in this particular picture, in the upper right, that's the Bay of Argos, where the Mycenaeans sailed for Troy. There are many, many graves at Mycenae, and there are also some really, really large underground tombs called tholoses that probably contain the remains of kings, but again, no one knows exactly where Agamemnon was buried. So those are two historical places. Now I'm going to turn to kind of this theme of the Titans and the Olympians that play such a big role in Circe, kind of framing that narrative that Miller puts together. There's a lost epic called the Titanomachy that describe the battle between the Titans and the younger gods. And according to some of the myths, Mount Olympus was created after Zeus and the younger gods defeated the Titans. Olympus is also the place where Prometheus went when he wanted to steal fire from Hephaestus and Athena from their workshop and give them to humanity. So this is a kind of, Mount Olympus is kind of a significant place, and yet is it a real place? And one of the things I learned is that in almost every part of Greece, there's a lofty peak that's given this name. So Olympus is a bit metaphorical, but there is an actual Mount Olympus in northern Greece. It's usually covered with clouds, as you can see in the picture. There are no temples there. I mean, this is where the gods lived. And so no one went there to worship. They stayed away. In fact, the first time someone climbed Mount Olympus was in 1913. I thought about climbing it when I was there, but you can see in that lower picture, this is the approach to Mount Olympus. It's a pretty daunting hike. It's about a 15-hour round trip. So I decided not to do that. Now, one of the oldest sanctuaries with a connection to the Titans is in northwestern Greece, and it's called Dedona, and the Greeks will say it Dedoni. So that's how I say it. It's also called Dedona, so you'll hear both those names. Dedona was the name of a nymph. In ancient times, there were many, many springs around this site, and you can see that it's still pretty green. Nymphs are minor water goddesses, and so they're associated, really the ancient site here, Dedona is associated with nymphs. And it's also associated with the worship of the Titan goddess Gaia, the earth goddess. So from around 1000 BC, there's evidence at Dedona that Gaia is worshipped there, particularly through the oracle. And we'll talk for a minute, in a minute, about the oracle. When Zeus enters the scene here at Dedona, this is one of the oldest shrines to Zeus, and it has its own origin story. There was a dove sent from Egypt, and it stopped in Dedona, and therefore they made that the home of Zeus. And it's Zeus in his aspect as the god of nature's rebirth. So you can see the connection between the cult of the goddess Gaia and the cult of the god Zeus. There's a connection here, and in fact, Zeus, you see his image on one of the coins from the site from the 300 era BC. You can see on one side there's Zeus, and on the other side is Dione, the goddess Dione. She's also a Titan goddess, and her name simply means goddess. So she's a very old goddess. And the name Zeus Naos, we'll hear Zeus at Dedona referred to as Zeus Naos. Naos is a reference to the naiads. And so he's the sky god. Dione is the fertility goddess. And so it's a very much an earth-oriented site, even under Zeus. What made Dedona famous was its oracle. Originally, under Gaia, there were priestesses who slept on the ground in order to be in contact with the goddess and to relay messages from her. So this practice is really continued under Zeus. He spoke to the pilgrims through the sacred oak tree. And if you look at the picture below, there's a tree in the center. The archaeologists who excavated this site, it's really still under progress. They planted an oak tree there so that you could get the feeling as you walked in of what it was like. And it's a very quiet place. And Zeus would speak through the rustling of the leaves. Later on, they made clappers that went around the tree, and he would also, the wind would ring the clappers. In the beginning, there were kind of as fitting for an earth goddess. There were no temples built here. And later on, they built a house for Zeus, this Iaria Oikia, the sacred house near the oak. And you can see the remains of that in the background. A lot of Mycenaean heroes were said to have visited this oracle or had some help from Dedona. One of them was Jason. He is said to have either have placed a branch from the sacred oak on the prow of the Argo, his ship, or another story says that his ship was built with an oaken plank that came from Dedona. So this is why the Argo was successful. In the Iliad, Achilles asks Zeus in wintry Dedona, which is a very cold place in the winter, to protect Patroclus. So that's in the Iliad. And then Odysseus, he visits Dedona with the question, should he return to Ithaca in disguise? And that's something about the oracle at Dedona. You submitted your question on a slate, and the answer was usually just a yes or a no. So obviously the answer was yes, because he came in disguise. And then finally, one of the last people to consult the oracle here was the Emperor Julian the Apostate in 362 AD, before he went to war with Persia. Well, he never returned from that war, so we're not sure what answer he got. Okay. Now let's see. Okay. Delphi replaces Dedona as the major oracle, and it is located on Mount Parnassus. This is a little bit closer to Athens. We're looking in this scene, there's Mount Parnassus there in the background, and we're looking at the temple of Apollo that was built around 510 BC. And it is Also has kind of its, really it's a very large complex. Delphi becomes so famous that it's almost like a city itself. And after the site ceased to operate as a sacred site, there was actually a town that grew up here and had to be removed in order to excavate these temples. Now, why is Delphi so important? According to the myth, it is the center of the world. If you look in the lower left, there's the navel of the world, or the omphalos. Two eagles were sent by Zeus, and they crossed paths at Delphi. And in this way, the Greeks identified this as the navel of the world, or the center of the world. But just like Dedona, Delphi was originally associated with the Titan goddess Gaia and her daughter Themis. Apollo comes into the scene later, the Olympians come in, and he conquers Python, which is a dragon who guarded Delphi's sacred spring. So again, it's built around a spring. It's associated with a serpent, and those are usually associated with, at least in Mediterranean cultures, with goddess worship. But the cult of Apollo was established on this site around the 8th century BC. People would come to Delphi. They'd walk all the way from Athens in procession 4 times a year. They had games. The Delphian games here were called the Pythian games. And they came on what's called the Sacred Way. If you look at this kind of this aerial shot of the Temple of Apollo, you can see a little walkway that goes around it. The pilgrims would process into the sanctuary along the sacred way, and they would make offerings. They would purify themselves as they went along. And so this was all part of a pretty elaborate religious ritual. What looks like a little house in the background is one of the treasuries where you could buy votives for your city. Okay, so the oracle. How did the oracle work here? The oracle at Delphi, even under Apollo, was female. They were called the Pythia, the oracles, and they served for life. And they were the ones who channeled messages from Apollo. And they were only there at certain times, 1 day a month, 9 months out of the year. The Pythia would go to the sacred spring of Castilia and would bathe, purify herself, ascend into the inner temple. When you look at these temples, the columns are on the outside, but inside there's a cella, or a sanctuary, that is completely enclosed. And so most people didn't go inside the cella. But in order to speak to the oracle, you'd go inside the cella when your turn was called, and you'd offer a sacrifice and then pose your question. And the Pythia would answer your question either in song or chant. There's a lot of discussion about whether the oracles were in a trance state, and speculation that they were inhaling gases from a fissure in the earth. But other observers who've looked at a few of the answers that have survived have said there's really nothing mystical in what the Pythia had to say. They pretty much offered standard advice about religious matters. If you want a male heir, you need to sacrifice 2 oxen to Zeus, and also political matters. Now, in the forecourt of the temple, as you were sitting there waiting to see the oracle, that's where you'd see the famous maxims like "Know thyself." Okay, so that's Delphi. Another site that has this kind of Titan Olympian transition feel is Olympia, which is to the south in the Peloponnesus. And the site of Olympia, this is looking down on the temple of Zeus at Olympia, was originally sacred to the Titan god Kronos. He's the one that's defeated by Zeus. And so a lot of these sites go back thousands of years, or at least centuries before they actually were Olympian sites. We think of Olympia as the site of the first Olympics, and originally there was nothing at Olympia other than the stadium on the right. You can see it's like a dirt stadium, and there's some stone seats on the side. It's pretty simple. On the left is a later gateway that was built as an entrance where the athletes would enter the stadium. We think of athletic events as probably as a secular pastime, but the earliest sporting competitions were actually funeral games. For example, Achilles held games in honor of Patroclus when he died. According to some of the myths, Zeus began the Olympic Games to celebrate his victory over Kronos, and they are very old. They're the oldest Panhellenic games in Greece, and Panhellenic simply means that it was kind of cross city-state. Everyone every 4 years would stop what they were doing, come to Olympia to compete, and there would be a temporary peace while the games were held. The oldest temple built at Olympia is actually the Iraeon, which is the temple of Hera. Originally, this temple was dedicated to both Zeus and Hera. And what happened is that over time, Zeus got his own temple, but originally they shared a temple. It's kind of reminiscent of the Thoni, where you had Zeus and Dione sharing the site. So there's always kind of a pairing of a god and goddess. Hera being Zeus's official wife and sister. Outside the temple of Hera, on that right-hand side, you see the altar, and this is where the sacrifices to Hera and Zeus were made, and it's also where the Olympic flame was lit. This is just a closer look at the temple. You can see it's not as large as the Temple of Athena. It's an older temple. It's also not made out of marble. It's made out of bricks, terracotta, limestone. The pillars themselves were originally made out of oak and gradually replaced. And one of the reasons the pillars don't match is the oak pillars were replaced over time. Now, when this temple was excavated in around 1875, it was discovered that there was a statue of Hermes buried in the temple of Cuda. And this is one of the really the best surviving statues of Hermes. And of course, he plays a really important part in Circe, but there are very few temples dedicated to Hermes. There are only 3 known temples because he was a traveler. He went here and there. So he didn't have his own temples necessarily. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia is really on the same scale as the Parthenon. It's very, very large. And these pillars, they're all tumbled down. They've reconstructed one of them, but if you look at the original pillar sections on the right, each of those segments is 7 feet in diameter. That just gives you an idea of the scale. This is an artist's recreation of what the temple would have looked like originally. Of course, all the Greek temples were, the scholars have discovered were painted originally. They weren't white, and the paint has just worn off over time. And in the back of the cella in the inner sanctuary was this statue of Zeus. And again, this is an artist's conception. I thought it was one of the better ones. No one actually knows what the statue looked like because it has completely disappeared. But when it was built, it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it is chryselephantine, which means it's ivory decorated with gold, like the statue of Athena. Now at Olympia, the statue of Zeus had to be built on site because it was so large. And this is the workshop of Phidias. He's the sculptor, the famous sculptor who built both of these statues of Zeus and Athena. And it's interesting that when this site was excavated, they discovered that a Christian basilica or church had been built on this over this site. And you can see they've scavenged some of these the stones from the temples and added them and used them to construct. In the back, there's an apse, which is a curved section, and in the front, there's a little. You can see a little bit of a screen, an altar screen. So this is kind of an indication of how this the worship continues at this site, even after it's no longer dedicated to Zeus. Okay, the last of the sacred sites that have Titan and Olympian connections that I want to visit is Delos. This is an island in the Aegean, so it's quite a ways to the east of Athens. And it is the birthplace, according to myth, of Apollo and Artemis. So again, Apollo and Artemis are brother and sister, but again, there's a god and a goddess representation associated with this island. According to the myth, the Titan goddess Leto was impregnated by Zeus, and Hera was so angry that she would not allow Leto to give birth anywhere on land. And so Leto had to find Delos, which was apparently at that time a floating island that wasn't attached to the seafloor, in order to give birth to the twins, Apollo and Artemis. Now, the magical thing about Delos when you visit it is that it's been uninhabited since really the 8th century at the latest. So, and no one is allowed to stay there overnight. And so in order to visit Delos, you come in on a ship. You can see there's a ship in the background of this picture, the harbor. You come in on a ship from nearby Mykonos, and you can stay there for a few hours, and then you have to leave. And so this is really, of all the places in Greece, where you just have a sense of stepping out of time and into the mythic past. It's really a remarkable place. Delos also was an important sanctuary of Apollo. It's only second to Delphi in its importance. And in fact, it's the oracle at Delphi who decreed that the island would be purified, which meant that no one would be allowed to be born there and no one would be allowed to die there. So people that were dying or giving birth, they had to go to nearby Rhenea. That was the island that's sacred to Artemis. And also all the graves were dug up on Delos and moved to Rhenea. So it was sort of an immortal place in a sense. And it became the most important gathering place for the Delian League, which was an influence in the Aegean in this period of time. And so the Ionians, who were the people of the Aegean and Asia Minor, would gather here and hold their festivals and gatherings. And it's very diverse compared to the other sites we've looked at. There are shrines for each of the 12 Olympian gods. There's one for Dionysius. There's a little shrine to Leto, who's Apollo's mother. And there's a shrine to Heracles, who's one of the heroes. One of the things I love about Delos are all the animals. We know in Circe, she's always surrounded by animals. There are several animals here. The dolphin was one of Apollo's sacred animals. The dolphin was also sacred to Poseidon. Marble lions were offered by the Noxians. That's the island where all the marble comes from. They built these islands around the sacred lake in the 7th century BC. And then in later times, in the Hellenic period, people came to live here and they built villas that had mosaic floors. And so this floor is decorated with a leopard, and riding on the leopard is Dionysius. In later times, in the Hellenistic period, Delos becomes more of a commercial center as well as a religious center. And so you've got all kinds of traders who are coming in here from different parts of the Mediterranean world. And one of the things they bring with them are temples to their gods. And this is when you start to see Middle Eastern gods and their temples established in Greece. So as you kind of wander through the sacred precinct of Delos, you'll see on the left a temple dedicated to the Egyptian god Serapis and the goddess Isis. And that statue there without the head, that's Isis. There's also, is the only place I saw a synagogue, ruins of a synagogue on Delos. Of course, there's no cult statue because Yahweh is a God who cannot be seen. And so at the center is a chair. It's called the seat of Moses. And this is where the rabbi would preside, presumably at this synagogue on Delos. So it's a really fascinating place. We think of competing religions, competing ideas about religion being, again, a modern phenomenon. But in Delos, it's almost like you could pick and choose where you wanted to go. All right, I'm going to end talking about springs and sacred continuities. There was a spring called Kanathos near Nafplio. That's a city about 50 miles from Athens. It's a beautiful place near the sea. Now, Pausanias is a 2nd century traveler, a Roman traveler, who wrote about a lot of these places. He visited the spring of Kanathos, which was, according to myth, where Hera bathed every year to renew her virginity. So he visited this place. And women would come and make offerings to Hera at the spring, and they would drink from the spring for help in childbirth. So my guess is that initially, before Hera, that this was a spring that was under the patronage of a naiad or a nymph like Circe. And after it ceases to be dedicated to Hera, it becomes a Christian shrine. And really the continuity of how the spring is used is really interesting. There's a women's monastery built in the Byzantine period called Aia Moni, which just means holy monastery. Women's monasteries and men's monasteries were both called Moni, which just means alone. So you have a temple, in essence, dedicated to women who are living a chaste life, and they are presiding over the spring. And you can see the spring is still there. There's a wall of the monastery where the water comes out into this basin. Today, it's called the Spring of Zohodoros, which just means the life-giving spring. And when I visited it in 1992, you could still see Greek Orthodox pilgrims, especially women, coming to visit the spring and to bathe in the water and to drink it. And the holy water from the spring is called ayismo. And you would fill up your little bottle and take home the spring water. And it is still associated with, people pray to the Panaya of the Zohodoros for help in childbirth. So there's a lot of continuity here in how the spring continues to be a female site and a sacred site with many associations. All right, that is the end of my slideshow. And I'm going to turn it back over to Julie for questions. Or to Tracy for questions, excuse me.
Okay, thank you so much, Victoria, for that incredibly informative presentation. There were a couple of questions that were asked in the chat. One was, do you by chance know if there were lions in Greece at any time, actual lions?
Yes, there were lions, because obviously we see lions depicted a lot in Greek art. So I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay, and another question that was asked, the information that you provided, it was so helpful and detailed. And are there any resources that you recommend for individuals who would like a refresher on gods and goddesses?
We have some, unfortunately, a lot of the great books about gods and goddesses are written for children, but we do have a lot of books about Greek mythology at 8th Day Books. So that is one place to visit. We do have a lot of mythological books. And then there are, of course, the writings of the Hero with 1,000 Faces. We also have a whole section of mythology for adults. I'm forgetting the author of that, very famous. But anyway, that would be a place to visit. There's some wonderful overviews. And I have to say that I myself, one of the things that kind of inspired me in visiting Greece, I was sort of, not only was I raised reading myths, but my family would read The Golden Bough, and we would talk about how everything has an earlier, every kind of traditional practice has some kind of earlier association or precedence. So even though The Golden Bough is pretty outdated, it's got some great information.
Okay. And then one of the participants asked, if you were to go back to Greece, what places would you like to visit and why?
Well, this is very interesting. I tend to go back and visit the same places, and I inevitably see things I missed the first time. So I'm kind of a boring traveler. I have actually been to, of course, I've been to the Parthenon every time I've been to Greece. I've been to Delphi twice. I mean, I like to go back and visit the same places, but there are still some that I have not seen yet. And probably the most important is Crete. I've never been to Crete. I have a friend who was born there, and so that's really probably next on my list.
And we've received some really positive comments in the chat, and they are compliments of your presentation. I think this has been one of the best presentations in the Circe series given by the Wichita Public Library. Thank you. And that you're an excellent speaker, and that very good information. Always happy to learn something new from a really well-versed person to add to prior learning. So really appreciate all of those positive comments. And I do not see any additional questions. Does anyone have any additional questions for Victoria they want to post in the chat real quick?
I want to add one more thing, Tracy, if I could. My husband, who is the true historian in the family, says that the lions in Greece were Barbary lions. Okay, so the person was asking about the lions. They weren't African lions, they were Barbary lions.
Thank you very much.
I learned something.